Okay. Hi, everybody. Well, we don't have that many people here, and I'll start off with a nice little introduction. Part of that, we've just got a handful of us, and we've delayed starting this, and we've decided to do something a little different, is because it's Easter Sunday or Easter Monday here in Australia. Easter Sunday for many of anybody else that would be attending, other than people that live in weird other hemisphere places like myself. So we probably should have scheduled something for Easter Sunday, but nonetheless, we're here. So there's a couple things that are going to happen with that. One is we're going to postpone going over chapter 3. So we're going to have a shorter video also. Chapter 3 is an incredibly important chapter, I think, in this, because we get into talking about science stimuli. And as I won't say much else about this other than in the process of talking about stimuli, it gets at one of those important places where we see a bridge between all aspects of learning theory, operant and respondent conditioning, and non-associative learning, and then also the ethological concepts. So I think it's something that's incredibly important. It would be nice so the simple answer is, let's wait to have that book club chat in May when it's not a holiday. And then for now, we're going to have about an hour chat, a little less than an hour. Let's see how accurate I am in this video and saying that it's going to be less than an hour. And it's the Easter egg special issue video. Although here in Australia, we don't have Easter bunnies, we have Easter bilbies. And then I would imagine that the Easter bilby isn't dealing with a chicken egg, but it's probably like an echidna or a platypus egg. So, just throwing that out there too. I don't know what an Easter egg looks like if it's a little mammal hatching from it. Also, if you didn't know mammals hatch from eggs, they do from monotremes. Now you know. So that said, this is just a special issue, and because a couple things have come up while we waited to see if other people might show up on a special holiday, and we'll get to talking about that. So I don't know if any of the people here want to mention some of these things or bring up something to talk about, but nonetheless, this is going to be uploaded as a special Easter egg video. Animal behavior.
They still do eggs. They still do eggs. Yeah, I mean, let's also talk about the fact that bunnies don't birth eggs. So
that's shocking, Lauren. What? I thought bunnies laid eggs. I thought bunnies were monotremes. No, the
irony is that
a bilby with a platypus egg. That's
it says just egg.
Right. No. So let me restate that so I can be clear about. First off, God, I should have played that off, by the way. I should have just pretended that I actually thought bunnies laid eggs.
Bunnies don't lay eggs.
Wouldn't that would be amazing though, if I honestly did, like, if I just thought bunnies were monotremes. Like I was like, yeah, there's the platypus and the rabbit and hare, right? So the lagomorphs are monotremes, and I just didn't really know that. Like I just had some really screwed up taxonomic knowledge along that, but I've ruined it. That possibility is gone. So but what I'll just say, we have Easter eggs out here that are the same thing, in that we have chicken eggs just as much that are painted and all that stuff. It's celebrated in much of the same way in Australia. Here, as far as I know, Australia's customs are still fairly new to me, given that I've lived here for 9 months or something like that. But yeah, they do Easter out here much the same. The only difference is we talk about the Easter bilby instead of the Easter bunny. But even that's kind of new. So, and in fact, I was given an Easter bilby, chocolate Easter bilby, and I was given a chocolate Easter bunny for Easter. So I was given both. So that just tells you. But I was musing over the fact that if it's an Easter bilby and it's a marsupial here in Australia, then maybe it delivers monotreme eggs I'm explaining this joke now, and that's always the worst. So let's just move on.
So, we were, before the recording hit, we were talking about procedures to work with, fearful animals.
Yeah,
Some of that was, we spanned, talking about constructional affection, constructional aggression,
Yep.
desensitization, counterconditioning, flooding, so sort of running the gamut. So maybe Eddie, just start with defining some of those terms, and then also so disambiguate all of those pieces for us. Then we can talk
Yeah.
about what those procedures or processes might actually be, and where they might overlap with other types of concepts in operant conditioning.
Yeah. So there's not much, I won't say too much about some of the history and some of these things. So there's a lot there. But I'll simply say, so out of all these procedures that have emerged now, and one of those historically that we can go, I mean, I published a few years ago the original sheep stuff that we did that was directly derived from Alexandra Kurland's description in the either the Clicker Journal or American Animal Trainer magazine or whatever it was. She described in 2000, she simply described how she had some fearful llamas when she was describing emotions derived from behavior, etc. She said she had a fearful llama she was around, quote unquote fearful. This is a 2000 article, and said she clicked and then walked away. And that was the procedure that she used. And at that time, so it was 2000 when I had started Orca, right? And in 2001 we started working with the Frank Buck Zoo, and they just gave us free range with their petting zoo. And some of the animals that we had that we were working with, actually I think it was the end of 2000, but let's not worry about the date. So 2001 I was full on working with Frank Buck Zoo. I and Orca, we were all doing all of that. And some of the animals we had to work with were these quote unquote fearful sheep, right? They wouldn't eat in your presence, they wouldn't get anywhere near you, etc. And I tried everything working with them. I was trying to figure out ways that I could use food to reinforce their behavior, trying to look for other reinforcers. At one point, I'd even created this whole, like, I thought I was doing the most ingenious thing ever. We had this large pen, and I was hiding in this shed in the back, and I had created this whole pulley system with strings that went to a box that I had built. And I would pull on the string, and based on the pulley system, it could lift the lid up, and it was a good, I don't know, a good 10 plus meters away from me, a good 30 plus feet away from me, hiding in the barn, almost on the end of the pen. And I go in there, and I'm looking through the crack of the door of this barn, and I'm ready to pull the string when the sheep are getting close, and instead they didn't even go near the box. They just looked at me, looked at the crack of the door as if to say, we know you're in there and we're terrified. So it didn't work. So I remember reading that article and saying, this is brilliant. And I took the article and ran into Jesus's office with the article and was like, this is how we're going to fix the sheep. So that's where we started thinking about, it was like, okay, so clearly what's happening here is she's using negative reinforcement to shape the behavior. And what's being done is, let's use escape, right, as the reinforcer to shape those approximations. So negative reinforcer, use the negative reinforcer that was maintaining the escape behavior itself. right? Running away gets you to be distanced from the animals. And now we could use that instead to get approach responses. We could change the contingency. That was the brilliant part of what Alexander Kurland described. So that's what we did. It honestly should have been my thesis. I'm disappointed that it wasn't my master's thesis, but I was already working on measuring shaping and all the stuff that we did with the goats. So also in the petting zoo. So this just became a side thing that we did as the project, and it worked, and it worked brilliantly. It worked as brilliantly as Alexander Kurland described. And we presented these results at Tech Saba and at ABA, what was called ABA back in that day in 2001 and 2002, presented these results. And I talked about it in some of those introduction to Orca articles that I published in 2000 and 2001. So that was kind of the start. And then completely separate from that, Kelly created her constructional aggression treatment, right, CAT, a few years later. And there were also some other things that some Orca people did, because it was such a profound thing that it was something that was described again later on to students, right? That, hey, you can use negative reinforcement to shape behavior. So and eventually that led to BAT and some of these other things, and how all these other renditions. So, which and different things that people have done, and I'm sure historically people have done other things like this. There's probably a long line of things that different people have done at different times. So all I can say is this was the sheep stuff, which I eventually, I mean, I just let the data sit there other than presentations I gave at conferences, which are all there. But it sat there unpublished until a few years ago, the sheep stuff. And then the other thing is that Grisha Stewart, in her original bat book, she detailed some of the history, because Grisha's really good at accounting for these historical facts. So her original bat book, before she changed it away from the use of negative reinforcement to the BAT 2.0 stuff, or at least from, I don't know exactly all the stuff that goes into BAT 2.0, but she no longer talks about negative reinforcement with it. So in the original BAT book, she details this history. So that's all I can speak to, the history of that stuff, and what's going on. I guess the other part that we were talking a little bit about was what's going on with some of these other things like desensitization and counterconditioning, and all these other sensitization, habituation, all these other terms that people are using. So is that enough to cover the CAT stuff, the negative reinforcement and shaping stuff? Do we want to go into?
I think so.
I think that's enough, yeah.
Speaking of cats, non-acronym cats.
I just want to say I adore the example of you hiding and the animals like not caring. You trying to deliver food. This is, when we talk about animals that don't eat because they're scared, people will often say, can you use really long spatulas or something? The sheep are like, I really don't care. You're trying to give me like $10,000 checks. You're a crocodile.
Right, right.
Don't care. A wonderful example.
Yeah, no. And it's really important, especially when you start thinking about what animals typically do, because, and that's a great example there, is because if the dangerous stimulus, right, if we're talking about the natural history, what animals have evolved to do, if the thing that is a danger is still present, why would you go into foraging mode, right? Just because, oh, it looks like it's a safe distance. And if this is the way these things kind of worked, then we would see a lot more examples of people training animals in the wild. Now, there are examples of people training animals in the wild, surely, right? There's lots of anecdotal examples and things that have been done, and there's even things that have been published, stuff related to conservation work and things like that. And there's wonderful examples of people effectively using even things like food rewards or social reinforcers, positive reinforcement in ways, especially now that's what's starting to come about with technology. There's things that Ken Ramirez has done for conservation purposes. There's some stuff that we've proposed to do with our gray-headed fruit bats out here in some of the grant work that we've done with trying to provide ways that these so the simple answer, I don't want to get bogged down by this. I'm going to go down this rabbit hole way too easily. But the simple answer is we're going to see probably a lot more wildlife stuff because we'll have technology that actually can make it where the aversive stimulus, the potential predator, is not present at all. So we should start, I mean, eventually we're going to start seeing people hanging devices in trees that are like these. What's the furbo? Is that the one that tosses the right? And what is
Yeah,
it?
so the furbo, it's camera and it tosses a treat, but there's the pet tutor is the real high-tech one.
The pet tutor is the one because that's the one. So Wes Anderson, Amanda Kowalski, and I have a paper that's about to be published. It's technically in press using pet tutors in the shelter. And then there's the stuff that Sophia Yin and I did with the treat and train a decade and a half ago that we started with the mechanical devices. But the furbo is the one. I haven't talked to Wes about this, by the way, at all, about like, can we attach some in like we've talked about doing this in zoos, using pet tutors in zoos, and I've tried to use treat and trains or I have used treat and trains in zoo environments and things like that. But my point being is just that like the furbo is already allows for some wildlife potential training using food reinforcers. And I'm surprised we're just not, somebody's got to be doing this anecdotally, but eventually I'd like to see stuff like that done for conservation work. I've proposed the use of other reinforcers, as I mentioned, for these gray-headed flying foxes, Australian gray-headed flying foxes that we have. I was part of a grant team out here, and there's continued work that we have trying to provide water relief. So it's still a negative reinforcer in that sense, but it's water relief because of our heat waves that we get here in South Australia. So yes, that is an Australian gray-headed flying fox, a fruit bat. It is Macrocoraptora. I'm gonna geek out just for a second here, or nerd out for a second here about what Coraptora are and the Megacoraptora. So what most people think of bats, that's what are Coraptora. Most people think of bats, they're the tiny little guys, right? So they're maybe the size of a rat. That's a big bat normally in most people's eyes. Most of them are the size of mice. So they're like a mouse with wings or a rat with wings. Those are all Microcoraptora, and those are the only guys that exist in the New World and in the Americas, right? You have to come over to Asia and Africa to see the Megacoraptora, and you can already imagine exactly what Megacoraptora are, considering I just called all those bats Microcoraptora. If bats, regular bats that most people think about, are mice or rats with wings, Megacoraptora are lemurs with wings. They're ginormous. I mean, they can get to a 1.5 meters, almost 2 meter wingspans, something like that. Actually the Australian gray-headed flying foxes get to I think about 4 feet, something like that, 4.5, 5 feet wingspan. So it's about 1.5 meters wingspan. Most of them are about 1 meter wingspan. So when I go out on these, there's a reason why I do a lot of night hiking and night walking out here, is because I go and I track these guys. So I follow them all throughout Gawler out here, and spend hours watching them. And I didn't want to nerd out much past the fact that the Megacoraptor are just these giant bats. So they're really quite large. Yeah. We'll get back on track. So the other thing is just to soothe people's minds.
A new boat.
Just to soothe people's minds, they're all frugivores, by the way. They're all frugivores. They eat fruit. So no giant bat is going to come down and suck your blood. So you're all good. All right. So thank you for cracking the whip there. Let's get back off the tangent. I had to nerd out about bats for a second because they're amazing. So lots of stuff has been done with trying to train or a little bit of stuff has been done so far with trying to train animals in the wild, including the stuff that
Canoe boat.
No, I know. I'm finishing with the talking about the use of reinforcers with animals, right?
Or?
Yeah. Because I was mentioning some of the stuff Ken Ramirez. Okay, some of the stuff Ken Ramirez, you're gonna put a timer up to the. Okay, we're good. Ken Ramirez has done some stuff with training elephants in the wild as well. So I think using new devices, we'll start to see some of the use of positive reinforcement with training animals in the wild. But otherwise, animals do, like, if a potential predator is present, it's very difficult to use food as a reinforcer with those animals. And hence why I think we've started to see the potential of using negative reinforcement, of allowing them to escape from our presence.
Functional reinforcers.
Yes, but let's not hide the fact that we're talking about negative reinforcement in this case for a couple of important reasons. One is because negative reinforcement, as I'm describing definitionally, is something that always happens. We are reinforced by consequences that are removed, right? So this is a natural part. I mean, we use alarm clocks. We have things like that happen all over. So, and the other reason is because negative reinforcement, as described in the animal training community, is not for somebody to be using a shock collar, pinch collar, or choke collar, and to be describing that as negative reinforcement. Oh, I'm just using negative reinforcement. The joke I've made in the past is that's like describing Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy as an excellent dancer, right? Okay, that might be true, but it is not the defining characteristic of them. It is certainly not the thing we think of, right? So what we should be saying about most of those aversive training procedures is that they are heavily reliant on punishment, and they use a little bit of negative reinforcement. In terms of they've applied so much aversive stimuli and punished so much behavior as a result of using all this aversive stimuli, that then they allow a very small number of things to produce escape. And because of that, we've treated the concept of negative reinforcement as if it's necessarily a terrible, horrendous thing. And I think that really does a disservice to the way that negative reinforcement often works. And by the way, behavior analysts have been talking about this for at least a half a century. Jack Michael was one of the first people in 76, 78 to talk about some of this importance in suggesting that it may not be as easy to even differentiate between negative and positive reinforcement. Okay.
We do try to use, let me get you to the canoe boat. So negative reinforcement is when we think about like fearful shelter animals. So we are the fear eliciting stimulus, right?
Yeah.
Just as to the sheep. So when we're trying to use a procedure like desensitization.
Yeah.
3 minutes and 44
What-
seconds. I wanted to know how long it was going to take until we got to a word that we were looking for.
Right.
And we call it maybe desensitization and counterconditioning, or we're using desensitization, well, an approach and moving or some sort of gradation of the stimulus over a period of time. I feel like those terms are potentially not entirely well understood.
Yeah.
That use them in conjunction with, like, well, we can just look at bat or cat as saying that that's a desensitization protocol, perhaps. And is that accurate, inaccurate, and in what ways is that inaccurate and
Yeah.
also accurate, so that we can really understand all of the component pieces and then put them together.
And to clarify for anybody listening who didn't know what you're talking about when you say CAT, you're referring to constructional aggression treatment.
I am
Or are
generally
you
referring to
also
constructional aggression treatment,
Okay.
but sometimes I'm referring to
constructional affection?
constructional
Yeah.
affection treatment.
Right.
Just to clarify.
And then BAT being the behavioral adjustment treatment, not an attempt to bait me into another rabbit hole. So
Yeah.
right.
As Caroline nicely noted, bats are the new penguins.
Right.
Apparently.
So we don't need
Have
that.
to
We don't need
that,
to get nerdy talking about micro and macrocaptor again, or megacaptor. So look, I don't have much that I'll say about. I've just talked a little bit about some of the history. I don't have much to say otherwise about cat or bat or what versions or renditions. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, especially the newer stuff that they do, and that I'm less familiar with. There's a lot of really so, and then connecting to the constructional approach and how that goes back to Izzy Gold Diamond and the stuff that Joe Lang talks about, and then the other stuff that's talked about a bit in the animal. I'll leave that for other people that are far more experienced, far more well-read in these topics, especially those individuals presenting a lot on constructional approaches and things like that. That's certainly the only thing I can say is it's certainly different than the original concept that we were doing, even what Kelly was necessarily doing. But there's a lot of stuff that still probably connects to the use of negative reinforcement. I just don't, I'm not gonna, let's move away from that, because I think there's a lot of stuff that still is not always clear, and it's a different topic, not clear to me. So there's not much I can provide insight to. But you talked about counter conditioning, desensitization, sensitization, some of these concepts, and the confusion that most certainly exists in the way these terms are used in the animal training world. So let's clarify some of where this starts. First off, we'll just talk about the fact that there's these things called sensitization and habituation, and the defining components of both of those, which don't have a lot to do with what we're going to talk about next, going into counter conditioning. They don't really have a lot, but the defining components of habituation and sensitization, habituation being this reduced response to a stimulus, and sensitization being an increased response to the stimulus with its continued introduction, with its continued reintroduction. Both of those are non-associative forms of learning, or what's sometimes called pseudo-learning. In that there's not a pairing to a stimulus or a response. It is non-associative as a result. It is simply the response to that stimulus itself. It's one of the reasons why a lot of time people will describe an associative process and say, well, it's habituated. It's like, no, habituation is not the same thing as conditioned. So that's a clear distinction that should be made.
Can we make the distinction too between habituation and like unpairing a response?
Right. Because now, but we're still talking about some, or it can, at least, we're still talking about a conditioning process. So if we're talking about either respondent or operant extinction, in both cases, we are talking about the presentation of the stimulus now in the absence of the stimuli in which it was presented. So could we produce extinction and habituation at the same time? Yes, and potentially, but the procedure we are describing procedurally, which is something that will come up here in a little bit, we'll talk about that. Procedurally, extinction, we're talking about the disconnection from its associative conditioning. So that's different than habituation and sensitization are described in the absence of the association being made, in the absence of the pairing. So that's just an important distinction. So all it means, habituation is to a stimulus and its reduced response with the continued presentation of that stimulus. Not a stimulus paired with the stimulus, because now we're talking about conditioning. So that's the definition of habituation and sensitization. So now we get to counter conditioning. And the simplest description of counter conditioning is that it is reconditioning. It is respondent conditioning. So it is a stimulus-stimulus pairing. And it is reconditioning. So as I mentioned before, we were recording here, Lily Chin has a lovely drawing she put out exactly a decade ago, 2013 or so, that shows how counter conditioning works. And we're just talking about if we have some conditioned stimulus, respondently conditioned stimulus. Perfect. That's the drawing Lauren's showing up there. I don't know how well that'll show it in the video. So regardless of, we have a conditioned stimulus, a presumed conditioned stimulus. So we can say something like, I'll give an example that's pretty common, a doorbell. Lily draws it as an actual bell ringing. So a doorbell rings and the dog starts barking. So we have a conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. We're presuming the doorbell did not elicit an unconditioned response. It was not an unconditioned stimulus. So there was some previous conditioning. So now what I do is I take the doorbell and I provide a new respondent conditioning procedure, hence why I call it reconditioning or counter conditioning. I present the doorbell, pair it with a treat, right? So CS, US, CS, US, CS, US, and now the CS elicits a different response. This is also why people will talk about conditioned emotional responses in association with counter conditioning, because all that a CER, a conditioned emotional response, describes is some emotional response. And we're describing the thing as an emotional response because it's something we've associated with being connected to emotions in some way, right? It's just a response. I mean, just to say conditioned emotional response, it's conditioned response and one that we associate with an emotional endeavor. So we don't need to go into that any more than to say that this is the response that has been reconditioned. So,
although just really quickly on that point though, we talk about conditioned emotional response as if all of the conditioned emotional responses are positive, because that's generally what we're trying to get to.
right.
But like say for the record that they can also be conditioned negative emotions. So we can condition
Yeah.
aggression,
Absolutely.
responses through that same procedure or process.
Or it's done.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
If you poorly, and exactly, if and sometimes you get an increase in, this undesired response when we're trying to get the desired response. But I've had folks be very surprised that you could condition something other than a happy response, because that's pretty much always what we're talking about when we talk about using these processes.
And that brings us to the difference between the theory of what we think we're doing, the procedure that we lay out, how well we do the procedure, and then what the outcome is. Because those are four very different, I think, get really intermingled.
Yeah. And I don't mean to hand wave at once we start throwing in this concept of emotion or emotional responding or any of this. I'm not meaning to hand wave at it. I have papers. Lauren Novak here, Lauren and I have in fact a paper hopefully to be published soon talking about the importance of studying affect and its connection to dog training and dog behavior. I have a similar published paper that talks about the importance of affective states in cats. So I consider the topic of emotion and emotional behavior, emotional responses in animals to be incredibly important just for our purposes and what we're talking about being conditioned. All I'm talking about right now, what I'm saying is when we describe something as a conditioned emotional response, we are talking about, and this is one of the important distinctions about when we talk about emotional behavior, emotional responses, we're talking about something overt, that it's directly observable. And so all I'm interested in talking about, and because of time also, I'm being cognizant of time here. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of emotions right now. Maybe that's another Easter egg at a later point. So we're just going to talk about the overt response, and it's important.
Now we're
Are you being surprised that I'm being cognizant of time at this point?
Yeah. I am also looking at the clock and saying it's 6:39, so it's 40 minutes into hour 2, and we are now just starting to talk about the thing that we were going to talk about for hour number 2.
Right. So we're getting there. There's not too much left to describe in the counter conditioning and desensitization and all this lovely stuff. So the point being, we're just finishing up on describing counter conditioning, which is simply reconditioning, and that's it. It's respondent conditioning, it's reconditioning. That is counter conditioning. John B. Watson was one of the first people to describe this process of counter conditioning. So and it's become an important tool in clinical work, behavioral clinical work. The first clinicians that were behaviorists were Pavlovian guys. They were respondent conditioning guys. These were the people that were doing this stuff. People like, including in the lab. So there were the clinical and laboratory, the applied clinical and the laboratory or basic or applied research clinicians. People like Liddell, who were looking at conditioned neuroses in goats and sheep. So speaking of bringing that back to sheep, so really important stuff that's been done, and this is where some of the concepts, even in talking about applications and describing things like conditioned inhibition, this all came from some of these clinical guys that were doing these models with animals. But again, not going down that rabbit hole for now. So yeah, so we get to desensitization now and how it relates to counter conditioning. So there's a couple important things to say with that. First off, the term systematic desensitization is something that originally Joseph Volpe, was one of these Pavlovian guys who was a clinical psychologist. He was a researcher looking at clinical applications. He originally described this as reciprocal inhibition. So, and what later turned into what he later described as systematic desensitization. Systematic desensitization is a type of counter conditioning, and that is incredibly important to say here. It is a type of counter conditioning. So, and it involved, as Volpe originally described, he would produce, he wanted to get an incompatible, a stimulus or event that was incompatible with the fear response. So to him, that's how he would create the pairings. So he used a relaxation procedure. So this is all being done with people. He would use a relaxation procedure, and then he would use the graded introduction of the aversive stimulus, of the fearful stimulus, so that he was reconditioning the response, that response. He was reconditioning respondently. So using Pavlovian or classical or respondent conditioning, it all means the same thing. So it's a respondent conditioning procedure, stimulus procedure, more of an event stimulus procedure, but that's fine, of what Volpe was describing. That's it. So those are the two components. So the way, whether we're calling it systematic desensitization or desensitization in the animal training literature, is still relies on that graded response. And the procedure is still importantly defined as both a type of counter conditioning and also as being respondent conditioning. However, so that gets us to the important point, I should say, before I get to the however. So there's no reason to say that you are using counter conditioning and desensitization, or counter conditioning and systematic desensitization. Desensitization is a type of counter conditioning. You cannot use desensitization and not be using counter conditioning, right? I cannot. So a canoe is a type of boat. A Honda is a type of car. I cannot, and I don't need to tell people like, hey, look at that really cool canoe boat. I don't need to say, look, that's a Honda car, right? I don't need to say, oh, look at that really cool Baccaraptora animal. So it is, if it's that one thing that falls under that category, it is all of the others. Desensitization is a type of counter conditioning. You can do counter conditioning without doing desensitization, but you cannot do desensitization without it being counter conditioning. Other types of counter conditioning include flooding. So, and then there's counter conditioning in the absence of either flooding or desensitization. The other important component is that desensitization often involves, it's a treatment package. And this is where I think more of the confusion gets put into play, because people say, but I'm doing more than stimulus pairings. Yes, because a lot of desensitization, for important pragmatic reasons, combines the use of operant and respondent conditioning as a treatment package. But it should be described as such, because the thing that you are doing is not, desensitization does not require an operant conditioning protocol being involved. It is defined by the respondent conditioning graded introduction of some fearful or aversive stimulus. The combination should be described therefore as such. So you should say, I'm using desensitization plus reinforcement to produce, to do this, or something like that. If you see in the literature, you'll see examples of where people will say things like, I'm using desensitization plus contact reinforcement. So there's examples of that, and that's the correct way to describe it. So my my simple response here to trainers is if you say desensitization, stop saying, so we need to, people should stop saying CC and DS or counterconditioning and desensitization, just say desensitization. It's necessarily counterconditioning. And then if you are, which you almost certainly are, using some type of operant procedure in combination with it, describe that, what you're doing. So it's, I'm using desensitization plus this shaping protocol. There.
And
But
that's
can
like
we-
what like LAT and BAT and all of those are treatment packages.
Wait, before we go
Oh,
into
yeah.
into what that is.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Aren't we saying, shouldn't trainers be saying that we're attempting to use and not saying that they're using
Right.
until you see what the outcome is? Because just
Right.
because you think that desensitization, we don't know if you're actually doing it until we see what the change in behavior is. And so where do you, from a terminology standpoint,
Okay.
where
You're
does that?
yeah,
'Cause
and
that
that's so to answer Mara's question really quickly, I don't know. I don't know what there's certainly treatment packages involved at some level with things that are doing, but I don't know. And I'll leave that to others to describe what can be happening. Again, so I'm escaping that conversation itself. What Lauren, what you're bringing up, so it is still the procedures that are being used are not defined by their outcome. They're not defined by their effect. So whether or not desensitization
Right?
based on contingent, yes, based on, so the contingencies are defined by their outcome, by their function, by their effect. Yes, but that doesn't mean, so for instance, we have lots of stuff. If I were using functional communication treatment, FCT, right? Commonly used by applied behavior analysts. We don't need to go into what that is. Just know that FCT is a common thing. If I were using FCT, whether it worked or not would not mean I didn't, like if it didn't work, I wouldn't say, well, then I didn't use FCT necessarily. It was still, FCT is defined by the procedure. Desensitization, so it's a procedure itself. It's a protocol. And that is, so if I do a functional analysis and the control condition is the prevailing result, right? And it's inconclusive what the function of the behavior is, I wouldn't say, well, then I didn't do a functional analysis. No, you still did an Awadian functional analysis, but you don't.
Yes, but you're not trying to change behavior in a functional analysis. You're just trying to figure out what the controlling variables are for that behavior. Whereas like with desensitization, people will say, oh, the dog is desensitized.
Yes. Now
You can desensitization and also the dog is not desensitized.
exactly.
But then you weren't actually doing desensitization. Or were you?
No,
But it didn't. Like that's what that's I think where the confusion
where
comes in. And one of the things between like how we talk about operant and respondent conditioning is so different, and that's where so much
can
confusion
be
comes in.
right. So I used a desensit. You can say I used desensitization, or more accurately, I used a systematic desensitization protocol, but it did not result in desensitization, or it did not result in a desensitized response. So,
But you could not say positive reinforcement protocol and it did not result in an increase in behavior, because that means you didn't.
Right. You wouldn't say I used reinforcement, but it didn't work.
Right.
But reinforcement is not a protocol. It's not a procedure. It is a contingency. And it is and it is defined by its effect. So we do need to make those distinctions between
Right, but trainers about it
As if it's
as
a procedure.
right.
Yeah.
yeah, right. So what you can say is
Instructional aggression is a procedure. That's
right.
the way that communication training is a procedure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
An
Right.
attempt at reinforcement.
Yes.
Yep.
Now, depending
May or may
right.
not have.
Yeah. And
sensitive.
Yeah, we can describe, and we can say things like, I tried using food as a positive reinforcer, or I tried using food I tried using reinforcement, but it didn't end up working. So you can say, I tried to implement this contingency and it didn't. I mean, that it's a little weird to say that, because chances are something was being operantly conditioned, or there was some, it's you messed up, not the reinforcement itself or something like that. But that's a slightly different component. But yeah, so the only other thing I'll say, because you wanted to know, I know, Lauren, you were talking about procedure, process, and outcome. So we've connected.
Like, where's the difference between the procedure, the process, and then what happens? So I think we just talked about the difference between what a procedure is and what an outcome is, and how those two things are related in operant conditioning and not related in respondent conditioning.
Yep.
And then there's the term process that people use. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I just don't know what that means.
And I don't want to, I won't go, I'm going to stick to the pragmatic or practical interpretation.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go down there. There are some actually brilliant papers that have been written, especially there's stuff that goes into the level, because even some of the comparative psych and some of the comparative behavioral neuroscience stuff that's out there that gets into some of this distinction of or distinguishing between processes and procedures and outcomes as well. So there's some really cool stuff that's been written along these lines.
Link or post to some of those cool things.
Yeah. I'll have to. I can. There's a nice article that talks about, but well, I'll leave it. Yeah, we can put a link there. I don't want to go down. So I'm just simply talking about. Here's what I'll leave it at. Why do behaviorists focus on procedure rather than process? So what is the point to that? And there's stuff that's been written about that as well. So behavior analysts should describe things in terms of procedures, not processes. And animal trainers, by the way, should probably rely, although I'm not 100% in agreement with this also, I should say, but the pragmatic rule is that a procedure is observable and definable, whereas a process suggests something that is not directly observable. So that is really that's why behavior analysts particularly, but behaviorists in general, have emphasized procedure over process. That's not by any means to say, and this is the confusion that people often experience when talking about these things, including emotions and emotional behavior, emotional response, etc. To say that I'm going to talk about an emotional response rather than the emotion, or to say that I'm going to talk about the procedure rather than the process, does not mean that I am denying the existence of the process or the emotion. It simply means what I have to work with in front of me is the overt response, is the thing that's observable, is the procedure, respectively, to what I was just talking about. So since I combined two different examples there, but that's it. That's really the emphasis on procedure over process. So when people talk about reinforcement as a process, that's why you would often see behaviors correct people and say something like, no, reinforcement is a procedure, not a process. They're not denying that there's some process that's happening. As Skinner pointed out quite clearly in About Behaviorism and other places, About Behaviorism being one of his probably most well-written books, he said, look, I don't know what makes a reinforcer reinforcing. That is for the anatomist, the physiologist. I'm paraphrasing, by the way. This is nowhere near as eloquently as Skinner put it. But He says, the anatomist or the physiologist of the future will be the one that tells us what makes a reinforcer reinforcing. What I have to deal with are the effects of reinforcement. Hence the emphasis on procedure. So what makes a reinforcer reinforcing is a process. And we can hypothesize about that. And there's some brilliant stuff even written, especially, I mean, that's one of the brilliant things that ethology has managed to do. And then when we start to look at things like affective neuroscience, the kind of stuff that Panksepp and others have examined, brilliant. There's lots of really cool stuff. There's, you know, like anything else, there's going to be some things I don't necessarily agree with. But the point being is, but that's not the territory of what we're dealing with and what most animal trainers are often not dealing with. So we're trying to be practical. It's one of the reasons why applied behavior analysis has been so successful, is because we move beyond the theoretical, the hypothetical, and deal with what is directly tangible. And I think that's the important lesson.
You give an example of a process, because I think anybody watching this knows what constructional aggression treatment is and like, oh, that's a procedure. Could you give an example of a process to help clarify the difference?
Well, the one example I just gave is the thing, you know, understanding how a reinforcer functions as a reinforcer. The stuff that, and what we'll get to in the next video, in the next talk, in the May talk, will be some of the stuff Tinbergen was talking about, which is, why is a sign stimulus? What makes a stimulus function as an eliciting stimulus? Often people forget that half of all of Pavlovian or classical or respondent conditioning is the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. So the process there is, what makes an unconditioned stimulus eliciting?
Why is that relevant to that individual?
And it's
Why does it
incredibly, and
why, yeah.
And there are overt components to it. So the overt components we can focus on are, what are the properties of the stimuli? And that's one of the things that makes Nico Tinbergen such a lovely experimental scientist, is because that's often what he did to understand some of the processes involved. Is he just manipulated the overt stimuli and said, this is the thing. This is what elicits that response.
And who originally documented or conceptualized MOs?
Jack Michael.
Operations?
Jack Michael, in what was his original, and the original establishing operation paper was 84, 86, something like that. And it was only in the I don't know, somewhere around 2010, maybe 2008, something like that, where he where people transition from calling them establishing operations to motivating operations, because the thing is, establishing operations increase reinforcer effectiveness, and as it was made clear, you have abolishing operations that decrease reinforcing effectiveness, including conditioned abolishing operations, which is off. I mean, if you want to see a conditioned abolishing operation, look what happens every time I see one of these advertisements for dog training on Facebook. You know, so one of these paid for advertisements, because everybody's been getting these, where it's like, I'll show you in 5 minutes what you can do to stop your dog from being a jerk. And then, you know, then it's like the person holding a leash and saying and I look at that video and I go, well, I don't want anything to do with dog training for the next like half a day. Because I just had to watch somebody describe something really terribly. That was a conditioned abolishing operation.
And you would call that a process? That process of abolishing.
Well,
abolishing operations is
the effect So the what's happening there is still procedural, but the thing that allows it to work is what I would describe as a process. Yeah. And so motivating operations are meant to describe a process, which, by the way, is the reason why some behavior analysts, from a theoretical standpoint, would get upset at even the use of the word, is because it's trying to describe a process. It's essentially trying to do what Skinner said behavior analysis didn't do, which is define and describe what makes a reinforcer reinforcing. So
Can I ask a question for those of us who aren't as wonderful as you guys are? So that example of the HADS for dog training, it abolishes the value of the reinforcer of social media for the behavior of scrolling?
the joking example I provided was that the abolishing operation of seeing the somebody trying to make a quick buck on Facebook by like saying, here's what your dog naturally does, or this is what your dog, and then they're just showing some terrible aversive technique or something like that, or something that's really weird. So I describe that as a conditioned abolishing event because it reduces the likelihood that I'll find any talk or communication about dog training after that, at least for some period of time, as being rewarding. So
Okay.
Like that was the joke. That was the and I just explained another joke. So
Well, I'm not bright enough to have figured it out by myself.
I know it was a
Bright enough to figure out
the point being is, it's
like,
here's the example I give to students about a good conditioned abolishing event. Is I say you go to a party and your ex is at the party. Right.
oh,
So
bye. Not going
right,
anymore.
right. I'm gonna go home and not
That's really
do
funny.
anything party related, right? So and then what I relate that to in dog training, what I say, a lot of the conditioned abolishing events themselves, or sorry, a conditioned abolishing operations, I should say. I'm mixing some setting events, by the way, are relevant to this topic, but we're not going to go down that route. So Keller and Schoenfeld's setting events were the original things described as establishing operations. So but the conditioned abolishing operations in this, one of the examples I use for the students, other than giving them that, like, you show to the party and your ex is there and you don't, like, there's nothing at the party, changes the entire party itself from having any potential reinforcing properties, right? So what a common thing, and where people describe this in school settings, but I think what's relevant for animal trainers is when you have a trainer that's associated with a lot of aversive events. And this is conditioned abolishing operations are incredibly important for potentially describing what's happening with trainers that rely on the use of aversive stimuli to train their animals, because the trainer itself may become that conditioned abolishing operation, and the dog no longer wants to work in the presence of that trainer. So anyway, I'll leave it. This is way, by the way, this is the limited stuff that I talk about with I don't this is not my field in any way, shape, or form. The issue of establishing / motivating operations, the fourth term, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there, but I've never, to me, once I start getting into talking about describing motivating operations in general, I say there's a lot of really important stuff in identifying those processes that are important from an ethological standpoint. So that's what I would rather focus on rather than this, the same way that I say, I don't know what the heck behavior analysts are talking about when they say automatic reinforcement. It's just an excuse to say it's something that's happening that we can't explain. So not going to go down that rabbit hole. That was enough for the Easter egg. I think we should,
Can I ask a tiny
yeah,
question and set you up for success? I'm gonna do this with tag teach. So context, I'm a tiny bit confused between when you said desensitization and counterconditioning.
yeah.
Define. Okay, wait. 5 words. Define desensitization in 1 sentence. Go.
Desensitization is a type of counterconditioning that relies on graded introductions of the aversive stimulus.
Wonderful. That's the thing that I wasn't necessarily clear if the words I was hearing were what I thought they were.
Yeah.
So bravo, big click for the 1 sentence.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah,
I really was a
yeah.
bit confused.
Yeah. We're good, I think. Are we
And we're supposed to meet with M's.
Yeah, we have to, I have another meeting that I have to shift over to. So we are just over an hour. What was the total time, Lauren? Because you were timing it. Of course you were timing it.
8 minutes.
What is
68
it?
minutes. 68 minutes. You only went 8 minutes over. I would like to congratulate you because that is a brilliant accomplishment for you.
Okay. All right. That's where 8 minutes over is still 8 minutes longer than but I'll take, that's fine. Approximations.
Listen,
Speaking of,
That is much better than an hour over.
okay.
Or 2.
Okay.
Or-
Well, right.
When we're trying to reduce our time, we reinforce anything that is the average or below.
Right.
This is
Right. We're working from
well
baseline here.
done.
Not everything in
Yeah.
one day. Not everything in one day. We're working from baseline. That's fine. If baseline was an hour and 58 minutes, then anything below that is good. Okay. So with that said, let's turn off the recording and there's the Easter egg, and thank you all for watching the Easter egg.
Thanks a lot.